America experienced its worst economic catastrophe in the 1930s. Because of how undeveloped our American welfare system was at the time, new kinds of reforms were implemented to focus on the welfare of the American people. In the 1920s, 3 Republicans held office in a row, each resisting progressive efforts. Also during the 20s, the Second Industrial Revolution occurred. Consumer products such as cars, refrigerators, electronics, and the electrification of homes were the biggest focuses of the time. Trickle-down economic thinking was dominant, causing companies to focus on profit and cut spending on their workers. Social reformers at the time were unpopular. African Americans, along with Latinos, Asian Americans, and women, felt the waves of the Depression the hardest. So how did the Great Depression begin? The stock market collapsed in October of 1929. Investors panicked when, after relying on credit to purchase expensive stocks, the prices plummeted. The investors tried to sell their stocks, the banks panicked, because they gave out too many loans. Citizens went to withdraw their savings, adding fuel to the fire. Businesses weren't doing well, were letting go of employees. The economy suffered, and so did all social classes. People lost their jobs, houses, shared apartments, lost possessions, faced evictions, lacked access to medical care, faced malnutrition, starvation, etc. The period of denial lasted from 1929 until 1933. The economic suffrage was obvious, but everyone assumed the economy wouldn't stay bad. With very conservative Hoover as president, social programs were sparse. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, he developed radical social reforms. Although he was born to a well-off family, FDR developed polio, and along with this, he developed a sense of empathy. He, along with his wife Eleanor, used their power to help others, including women, African Americans, and the unemployed. During a time of great despair in America, FDR improvised initiatives for the welfare of the people. There were forces promoting these reforms, and there were also forces limiting FDR's policies. The promoting forces included the power base of the working and middle-class citizens, the realignment of parties, but especially the magnitude of suffering and harsh realities people were facing, and not to forget the physical and emotional support of Eleanor. The limiting forces included conservatives that rejected FDR's rhetoric and big federal government ideals, adverse rulings by the Supreme Court, lack of support from farmers, and absence of a well-developed radical movement in the U.S. The greatest challenge was to find funds to support these social programs. FDR came up with an ingenious strategy to increase federal spending, but separate the budget into regular and emergency spending. Now he could promise to balance the budget. Now that there were funds, FDR created the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FARA, the first federal welfare program of the nation's history. After some criticism, FDR moved from this cash assistance program to creating work relief programs. Hundreds of thousands of projects were created, but still the programs focused on unskilled workers, so complex projects were impossible. Therefore, he developed the Public Works Administration, or PWA, to focus on more complex projects such as natural disaster relief, constructions of schools, bridges, airports, etc. FDR was determined to end the Great Depression. Some strategies he tried were increasing federal spending, restoring confidence in banks, stopping the vicious circle of job and price cuts in industry, stopping the vicious circle of price cuts and increased production in agriculture, averting foreclosures, and reviving economies in vast regions. Next, he enacted unemployment insurance along with old age pensions. The New Deal was the most successful during 1935 to 1936, when the Social Security Act, the National Labor Relations Board, the Works Progress Administration, and the National Youth Administration were all enacted. Roosevelt was re-elected in 1936, however, was faced with numerous political barriers that caused a stalemate in the end of his reform movement. Middle-class voters were shifting to the Republican Party, and a growing number of people questioned FDR's expansion of federal government because the Depression still wasn't over. Many vulnerable groups, such as African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and women, felt excessive economic suffering and questioned the New Deal's interest in these specific populations. Surprisingly, though, in 1937 and 38, FDR was able to develop some successful policy reforms like the funding of the New Deal programs, Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, the Wagner-Steagall Housing Act, attacking administrative abuses of welfare programs, and reorganizing federal social welfare programs. At the end of the 20s and through the 30s, there was a huge demand for social workers. Thousands of jobs opened up in this field, and even more during World War II. Most social workers supported relatively liberal social policies, which caused some controversy. Policy advocates of the New Deal can teach us that programs would not have endured without federal funding, partnerships with federal government and state or employers was essential, and social workers have to be familiar with federal, state, and local programs to ensure their clients' needs are met.